bill cost Kevin McCarthy his job. I don't know how it costs whoever the next speaker is his or her job. So again, if people want to look back at January 6th, and if Liz Cheney wants to do that, that's great. I'm trying to figure out what happens in the next 45 days.
Well, also in the next 45 days, Mick, theoretically, the impeachment inquiry, which Jim Jordan was helping lead, will continue. And I wonder what a speaker, Jordan, potentially would mean for those individuals in districts that Biden won in 2020, those vulnerable Republicans. Do you realistically think they can go to the floor and allow him to get the gavel? What would it mean for them?
I think, first of all, I don't think he can be in charge of the investigation if he is the speaker. So they got to have somebody else to back up. The same is true, by the way, and I still think there's a likely chance that Patrick McHenry's role as the interim speaker is somehow extended for a period of time. And if that happens, he might not be able to function as the House Financial Services Committee chairman as well. So if Jim becomes the speaker, they have to find somebody else to do the investigation. What happens from there, Kaylee, I think depends on what the evidence is. If they find, keep in mind, the Democrats had an impeachment inquiry on Donald Trump for weeks before they started the actual impeachment. They didn't have the evidence until Trump gave them the transcript of the phone conversation with Zelensky. But for that, they probably don't have the ability to impeach him on the floor. I think the same is true of the Republicans. They're going through the inquiry now. If they find evidence that justifies an impeachment, then they go that route. But if they don't find anything, I don't think they can move forward. So I think the only thing that changes there is who's running the investigation. If Jim Jordan is speaker, I don't think he can run the investigation.
I have to go back to our conversation with Jim Jordan on the 2nd of October. Kaylee already referred to it, Mick. You know exactly where we were. In the balcony off the Cannon Rotunda. It was the day the government was supposed to be closed. And this all came up again with who wants to be speaker. Here he is. But
I do not support that. I think Kevin McCarthy's done a good job. I mean, we told the American people that we would, pass legislation to get rid of the 87,000 IRS agents. We told the American people we'd pass the Parental Bill of Rights. We did that. We told the American people we would pass legislation to deal with the energy problem. We told the American people we would pass the toughest border security immigration enforcement legislation in history, and we did that.
He said he wanted Kevin to be speaker. When I asked him directly again, he said, no, I do not want to be speaker. Mick, do you believe that your old colleague from the Freedom Caucus, Jim Jordan, actually wants this job?
No, I think he wants Kevin McCarthy to be the job and go back to doing to leading the investigations. I think he's where he is now because who else is there? I mean, when you get down to the next level, you're talking about people who might have only been in Congress a couple of years. You don't know about their conservative.
So he would be a reluctant speaker in your view.
I think so. And I got to think, Joe, I got to think that he's got to deal with the far right wing, with those anarchists. And again, they're not conservative. They're populist anarchists. That's the Matt Gaetz crowd. So let's call them the anarchist wing because they're not the Freedom Caucus folks. He's got to have a deal with them that says, look, if I cut a bipartisan deal to open the government, are you gonna try and get rid of me? And at least he's got to have a handshake that they won't do that. Because again, otherwise, what's the one lesson from Kevin McCarthy's experience? If you bring a bipartisan bill to the floor of the House, you are at risk of losing your speakership. That's a really easy message to sort of deliver and to comprehend. So unless Jim has got a deal with those folks that I don't know about, that we don't know about, then he might be in the same position Kevin is a couple weeks from now.
Nick Mulvaney, always great to spend time. Did you say whether you think he's actually going to get this vote tomorrow? Did we hear?
It changed in the last 3 to 4 hours, Joe.
Okay, so you think he's going to get this at noon tomorrow, Mick?
I think his chances went from 2-10 to 6-10.
All right, there it is. Mick Mulvaney. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. I'm Steve Rappaport. We check the markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Currently, we have the S&P 500 up more than 1%, the NASDAQ up more than 1.25%, the Dow up less than 1%. Over at yields, we have the 2-year at 5.09, the 10-year 4.71, COMEX gold $1,931.80 an ounce, NYMEX crude trading at $87.04 per barrel. That is down less than 1%. Spot gold, that was 1918 and 93. Over in currencies, we have the Japanese yen at 149.58, the euro 10553, British pound 12212. And Pfizer has announced that it is cutting $9 billion from its annual sales guidance due to a drop in demand for COVID-19 shots and COVID treatment pills. The announcement was met with relief from investors eager to understand Pfizer's post-pandemic growth strategy. Shares climbed as much as 5.6% earlier today, and right now we have Pfizer trading up more than 2.75%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
They're dropping like flies now, those opposing Jim Jordan or sitting on the fence. And we're hearing a lot of people, Kaylee Lines, talk about a potential speaker, Jim Jordan, which even on Friday, when we spoke with Bill Huizenga, seemed like beyond a long shot when you have over 50 votes to make up. But he's going to force a vote at noon tomorrow.
Yep.
And it's anyone's guess, but he may well wrap this thing up a lot sooner than some people thought.
Yeah, what's clear, Joe, is that even though the House technically went home Friday evening and it has yet to return, they'll convene later on this evening, he was working all weekend, working the phones. His allies were as well, trying to whip the votes for him. And it seems like those efforts have paid off. We don't know if they've gotten him there to 217, but they certainly have helped him pick up more votes, including from 3 individual members who we thought might not ultimately back him.
And there are members like Mike Rogers that, once they turn, they could bring others with them, give it the safe to get back in the water kind of sign. But yeah, big questions about what kind of deals are being cut in these conversations. That's where Jack Fitzpatrick comes in from Bloomberg Government. He's with us now at the table. It's good to see you. I'm sure that you've never been busier. Well, there was that whole fiscal cliff, and then there was the shutdown. Now there's this. Pretty remarkable to watch this come together in the last couple of hours. What can Jim Jordan do that Steve Scalise cannot? I thought Scalise was the whipper here.
Yeah, well, for one, Jordan has probably a bit more credibility with the hard right than Scalise, and more members see him as a break with the traditional House Republican leadership. So if it comes down to striking deals and making compromises and making promises to the more governance-oriented wing, if Jim Jordan says to Matt Gaetz or someone along those lines, this is the best deal we're going to get, there may be a little more faith in Jim Jordan on the hard right than there was for Scalise or anybody who was for a long time tied to House Republican leadership.
Well, to return, though, to the conversation around what deals are being made, what promises are being made, when we look at the 3 really that we've all taken notice of today, Mike Rogers, Ken Calvert, and Wagner, these are all people who are defense appropriations hawks, right? So would it be too far removed to suggest that perhaps that is what this came down to ultimately for these individuals? Jordan was like, hey, I got you on defense, and therefore he gets their vote.
There clearly is a conversation along those lines and some sort of promise being made. We don't know exactly what it is. But Mike Rogers, the House Armed Services Committee chair, said on X today that they had a conversation regarding appropriations and the National Defense Authorization Act, and he is satisfied enough to support Jordan. So there is some sort of plan developing to pass appropriations bills to move forward and avoid cuts to defense spending. Remember, though, that if they rely on a stopgap for any portion of the government, all of it, the discretionary side, is cut by 1%. So in order to avoid cuts to defense, you have to find a deal for all 12 appropriations bills, including Democrats' favorite. It's a very ambitious goal to set to avoid that 1% cut to defense.
Should we tell them about the real deadline?
Yeah, this was news to me.
This blew my mind a little bit earlier,
I
but
feel
Jack
like
does
Jack
that a lot too.
should enlighten everybody else.
So just to back up a little bit, you've heard Kaylee and I agonize about this idea of a 1% budget cut across the board if they don't get this thing done by the end of the year. That was part of the debt ceiling deal. And I said, gosh, well, sure, they'll have to have a budget by then. Nobody would take a cut like that. Well, the guy who reads the fine print around here is Jack Fitzpatrick. And the real deadline is actually sometime next spring.
Yeah, April 30th is the effective deadline. I overlooked it for a while. Below the text that says December 31st in the debt limit deal, it actually effectively says April 30th. The deadline to avoid the 1% cut at face value is the end of the calendar year. But in order to sequester those funds, the Office of Management and Budget at the White House has to issue a sequestration order. That wouldn't happen legally until April 30th. And if they get a deal in the interim, anytime by April 30th, the cuts are not put in place. So it is a little less pressure than lawmakers thought they had. It's really an April 30th deadline.
Does Wall Street know this, Kaylee?
I don't know.
This is amazing. This is market-moving stuff.
I literally didn't know this until approximately 8 minutes ago.
Right,
so, yeah, we should start putting this out there more. April 30th.
So they
the real
could roll
deadline.
continuing resolutions straight through the first half of next year almost.
I guess theoretically, but it becomes a question of whether or not a continuing resolution can actually pass. Even if Jim Jordan gets the gavel, he's pretty much immediately going to be faced with that November 17th deadline. Funding runs out at that point. And there's probably not time to finish the rest of the actual single subject bills by then, right? So it would have to be a CR.
Yeah, I mean, they're not making any progress on their appropriations bills.
Yeah.
Obviously, now they're busy with trying to find a speaker. They have only done 4 of the 12 bills in the House. They have failed on a 5th. The remaining ones are very, very difficult. They're some of the things that Republicans don't support. The labor HHS education bill is something that enough conservatives want to cut so much that I don't necessarily know how the moderates agree to it. So there's a lot of back and forth that has to happen to fund the government that they have not been working on. And they face a November 17th deadline, which is, even if they were making progress now, it'd be very difficult to get all those bills done by then.
So we have to talk about Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border, all of which we're told could come together into an omnibus spending package. But again, we were told Republicans had an allergy to an omnibus and that could never pass in this House. Will it be different for this because of the subject matter?
This supplemental, which would be much smaller than a true omnibus of the 12 appropriations bills, could be acceptable. The real objection from conservatives, from the hardline people on the right, would be to the idea of adding Ukraine in there. Right. Matt Gaetz kind of led a charge, along with kicking out Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, of turning the House Republican Conference, at least its majority, against Ukraine funding, and that block of members wants any vote on Ukraine aid to be a standalone, so they can reject it and not get pressured into voting for it along with Israel aid. Then again, there are members, Mike McCall, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who said, let's do all 4 together, Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, the border. Rosa DeLauro, the top Democratic appropriator and a progressive, said she could accept a border appropriations measure along with those. So there's bipartisan interest in something pretty big, but you are going to see pushback from the hard right on the Ukraine portion in particular.
So it becomes a question then of who ultimately could keep the hard right in line on that, right? Or at least get them to support, and whether Jim Jordan could actually do that as Speaker. But we were just talking to Mick Mulvaney, who, of course, knows Jim Jordan very well. They were co-founders of the Freedom Caucus together. And he essentially said he may face the same fate as Kevin McCarthy, where you try to do anything in a bipartisan manner and you get kicked out. So how do we even break out of this cycle? I don't even know if that's a fair question to ask you, Jack, but...
It's worth noting that Jim Jordan does not have a record of selling people on a compromise. And anything that you get through a Democratic-controlled Senate and get President Biden's signature on has to be a compromise. He has not proven an ability to do that. His career in politics has been the opposite, of rejecting the deals that he doesn't like. And that's going to make everything Congress needs to do more difficult if he is Speaker.
So what are you hearing from the appropriations community? I mean, how nervous are they that the pieces just won't be in place? The gavel won't have a speaker to get all this done?
There's so much uncertainty. You can count on dragged out deadlines. I don't think anybody is holding out hope for a November 17th deal. There are people who really want to avoid being given a deadline right before Christmas. That was something Kevin McCarthy worked hard on, although he's not the speaker anymore. We'll probably look to spring. If you want to be optimistic, maybe there can be a deal before April 30th. But the chances of a full year CR that has automatic 1% cuts are not something that you can discount. They're making so little progress right now that is really on the table.
Amazing.
It's fascinating.
Yep.
And of course, when we're talking about what's going on in the House, to Jack's point, the Democrats do control the Senate. A Democrat sits in the White House. It's going to have to be bipartisan just by nature. And I just wonder, even if we do suddenly get a Speaker of the House, if shutdown risk might actually only go up for that reason.
Absolutely. You've done this, you work on Capitol Hill every day, and you have for a minute, Jack. Is this as dysfunctional as you've ever seen it?
Oh, that's hard to say. It's been really dysfunctional
for a
while.
Your entire period has essentially been one of dysfunction.
Yeah, they didn't shut the government down. They didn't default, which they've never done. They got through 2 deadlines. They have more deadlines to go.
What's everybody complaining about?
We had a 34 to 35 day shutdown in 2018 into 19. It could always be worse, but this is very, very bad, and the speaker issue is unprecedented. So you can't make predictions.
I feel like we can set new records. I think we're capable of that. What do you think, Kaylee?
I'm not taking a side on that bet.
It's good to see you. Don't be a stranger. Jack Fitzpatrick, Bloomberg Government, everyone. Find him on the terminal. As we get a check now on world and national news with Dan Schwartzman. He joins from the Bloomberg newsroom in New York. Hi, Dan.
Thanks, Joanne Kaylee. Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has told Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's in the region for a second time in a week, that the country is preparing for a long and costly war that Israel will win. With Israel's military having announced that it plans to go into Gaza by land, sea, and air, Mick Mulroy, a former CIA officer and co-founder of the Lobo Institute, says the attack should be coming soon.
They're going big, and it's going to be violent. They'll probably have some come in from the sea to create a dilemma from Hamas, maybe some coming from the air to try to drop behind them in central Gaza, to try to create a dilemma and envelop them. But once they get into the actual fighting, it's going to be block by block. I'm hearing the Israeli planners that talk about upper and lower Gaza. Upper being buildings and everything that you see normally in a city. Lower is all these tunnels. There's around 300 miles of tunnels down there. And that's going to be bare militarily to try to conquer.
That's Mick Mulroy of the Lobo Institute, who was a guest on Bloomberg Markets. You can hear more of his thoughts on today's edition of the Tape Podcast. A settlement has been reached between the federal government and the lawyers representing thousands of families who had been separated at the southern border of the U.S. during the Trump administration. The migrants will be allowed to stay in the country and apply for asylum, which will put them on a path to permanent legal residency. Now, as part of the deal, the government has agreed to refrain from similar separations for 8 years. The agreement will have to be approved by a judge. Now, according to the Department of Homeland Security, close to 4,000 children were separated from their families between 2017 and 2021. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. I'm Steve Rappaport. We check the markets all day long at Bloomberg, starting with the big three on Wall Street. The S&P 500 up 1%, Dow up less than 1%, the NASDAQ up more than 1.1%. Two-year yield 5.09, the 10-year at 4.70. COMEX gold trading at $1,932 an ounce. NYMEX crude 86.59 per barrel. That is down 1.25%. Spiking oil prices gave concern to what will happen if the conflict in the Middle East spreads beyond Gaza. Bloomberg Estimates says that it could top $150 a barrel if the conflict spreads. Let's talk Bitcoin for a minute. Shares took off on a rumor, but then some of those gains were pared back once reality kicked in. Bloomberg's Erica Herskowitz reports.
Steve, Bitcoin reversed an earlier gain of as much as 10% after BlackRock said that its application for an exchange-traded fund that invests directly into the cryptocurrency is still under review. Speculation swirled on social media that BlackRock, which in June submitted an application for a spot Bitcoin ETF, received a green light from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to launch the first such product in the U.S. That spurred the surge in the largest coin, though Bitcoin quickly reversed the majority of those gains after the rumor was debunked. Steve?
Thanks, Erica. Currently, shares of Bitcoin are up more than 4%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
It's been truly incredible for the uninitiated, that makes most of us, to watch the Iron Dome in action as Hamas sends thousands of missiles into Israel. And Kaylee Lines, this system, while it has let some rockets through, has been functioning incredibly well. It's in the 90-something percentile of the number of missiles, the rockets that it's been able to knock down. But they're going to need a lot more missiles, these interceptor missiles, to try to keep everyone safe in Israel, and that's where the U.S. comes in.
Yeah, in replenishing. And of course, there is existing authority for the U.S. to do this already. The U.S. obviously provides billions of dollars a year to Israel. There are certain things that the executive branch can do on its own. And yet, if we're going to need to see further funding for further weapons Israel may need, as Israel is framing this as a fight that, frankly, might not be wrapped up anytime soon. They are framing this as something that could last for an extended period of time. You may need Congress to get in to actually okay all of that appropriations,
that is
and
true.
that's where it gets really tricky.
And in a couple of weeks, that's going to become a much more urgent scenario because I think, to your point, we're still working off of our own stocks of these interceptor missiles. Joining us to talk about this and a lot more, is big news on Lockheed today, is Tony Capaccio, Bloomberg's Pentagon reporter. Tony, it's great to see you. I appreciate the time here and what's a very busy period for the Pentagon. Of course, you wrote that story about replenishing those interceptor missiles that are used as part of the Iron Dome air defense system. Do we have a sense of when our replacement munitions might run out? How long can they do this?
All right, so here's the deal. It's very confusing. The Pentagon has told us that U.S. stocks in Israel were transferred to the Israeli Defense Force. They won't say what those were doing there or not. The big question is this. When will Secretary Austin order the Army to send in the missiles we have for two existing Iron Dome Army batteries? There are about 312 of these missiles in our U.S. inventory in the United States. So the big question is, when is Austin going to direct the Army to send those over? The Army has two of these Iron Dome batteries, Joe. They were basically kind of forced on by Congress a few years ago as part of the short-range missile defense. So the Army's got these two batteries. They're not sure what they're going to do with them, but it looks like the missiles are going to go to Israel. They're going to get airlifted at some point. But we're wondering when the Secretary of Defense will directly order that. So it's not a lot of missiles, but it's enough because each of those launchers fires about 20. They carry about 20 of them. And the thing with the Iron Dome, the radar is so precise, it can determine when missiles are going to unoccupied areas and not fire at those. That's kind of the beauty of the command and control on its system.
Amazing.
Okay, so Tony, you say you were waiting to see whether or not the Army actually sends those. What would be holding the U.S. back from sending everything it can at this point? Why wouldn't that already be underway?
Authorities, they need the Secretary of Defense to sign off specifically to the Army to do it. As of this morning, he hadn't done it yet. He had not issued the order yet. It'll happen, I'm sure, but it just hasn't happened yet. The missiles that were in Israel, I think, were produced by Rafael, with Raytheon parts, by the way, for the Army and never shipped. So they're over there. We just don't know how many there are there. But the other question is these joint direct attack munitions. Boeing makes these kits. Israel has dropped, they say, like 6,000 bombs so far in the campaign. As far as I know, these JDAM kits have not been shipped from the United States. And there's about 1,000 of those, from what I understand, that are packed and ready to go when the order happens.
You're getting the sense now of how much Tony knows about this stuff. Tony, you've got a great story about Lockheed Martin on the terminal today. I want to ask you about Category 1 deficiencies. I love Pentagon jargon, and of course you live by it. The fact of the matter is, it's the most expensive military system in history, the F-35 fighter jet. And as you're reporting, Lockheed continues to produce these jets with flaws. What's going on?
Yeah, this is not a good situation. They've already delivered 975 of these planes out of a roughly 3,200 program, if you count international partners. They've been producing these for a long time. We reported last August that they were having these issues. I asked the Pentagon's Defense Contract Management Agency for an update, and we got these answers. And the disquieting thing was that 4 jets that had been delivered in pretty good condition to this Marine unit in Cherry Point, North Carolina, had reported Category 1 defects. So there are 2 categories of Category 1. There's A and then there's B. A are life-threatening, which these were not. B are mission-critical defects that could impact an aircraft doing its complete mission. Why Lockheed needs to get these things back, get this defect rate down, is the Pentagon is yet to make a full-rate production decision on this program. Believe it or not, they've produced like a third of them already. But as part of a full-rate production decision, Lockheed has to demonstrate that it has its manufacturing processes in place and working well. And this defect scrap and scrap ratio issue is one of those metrics that they will be judged on early next year as the Pentagon decides whether to go into full-rate production with this plane.
If they don't make that decision, if they decide to take the third they already have and not continue with the other production, does the Pentagon get its hundreds of billions of dollars back, or any of it back, or is all this money just said goodbye to already?
No, they're not going to cancel the program. If this full-rate production decision doesn't happen, they're going to keep producing them under what's called low-rate initial production contracts. Basically, they keep cranking them out, but they still have these issues. And I have no doubt that Lockheed will get them under control. They seem to have got them under control. The overall number of ongoing deficiencies has dropped quite a bit. But in this case, these 4 planes that the Marines reported on were serious enough that Lockheed technicians had to go to Cherry Point to fix them. And that's not a good situation.
Wow. No, it's not. Tony, you know, Kaylee's dad used to fly Tomcats. Why don't we just start bringing back the old F-14s? You know what? They worked.
Well, they worked, and they were also the star of the first Top Gun movie for those aviation aficionados who watch you.
Yeah, right. I mean, we all grew up with the Tomcats. It's time to bring them back.
That's right.
This fly-by-wire thing. How about fly-by-cable? Let's go old-fashioned here, Tony.
Well, old-fashioned probably works a little bit better if you're flying against Al-Qaeda or some low-tech threat, but I don't think against China or Russia or Syria that would be a great choice.
Fair enough. Can't you tell they love when Tony comes into the press office at the Pentagon with questions about the F-35? He's doing great reporting on this. If you search Tony's name on the terminal or go to Google, plug it in. He's been leading the charge on some really important coverage, especially with Lockheed. Kaylee reporting earnings this week. All this will be mentioned, I'm sure, in the conference call.
Absolutely. Also, as my takeaway, the F-14 is not coming back.
That's true. Yeah, it's not coming
Sorry,
back.
Dad.
Yeah, no, we can't make that happen. even with Tony's help. Tony Capaccio, great reporting, and thanks as always. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Steve Rappaport. Some of the biggest U.S. banks are scheduled to report earnings this week. It begins with Bank of America and Goldman Sachs tomorrow, followed by Morgan Stanley Wednesday. We get more from Bloomberg's Sri Natarajan.
Those three also happen to be the three worst performing big bank stocks. Slightly different dynamics. With Bank of America, you'd be looking at what are they saying about the economy? What are they saying about loan losses? Because that's what we heard from JP Morgan and Wells Fargo. Despite improving their NII outlook, JP, Wells, and even Citigroup talked about loan losses increasing on the forward. With Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, however, all the commentary and all the focus will be where are they seeing the rebound in investment banking activity.
Thanks, Sri. Trading halt.
All the focus will be where are they seeing the rebound in investment banking activity.
Thanks, Sri. Trading halted on Rite Aid after the pharmacy giant filed for bankruptcy protection. Bloomberg's Steve Potus reports.
It plans to close more of its remaining 2,100 stores while hiring a new chief executive with turnaround experience. The chain has landed nearly $3.5 billion in funding from lenders as it restructures its debt. Like other pharmacy chains, Rite Aid has been dealing with claims it filled unlawful prescriptions for opioid painkillers. Now, if it fails to survive, 47,000 jobs could be on the line.
Thanks, Steve. And the parent company of Grubhub says it's working on an artificial intelligence-powered assistant to help customers build and customize their orders through text and voice ordering. Just Key Takeaway says the AI assistant will be rolled out with some customers in the UK in the next few weeks. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington, where we're following a couple of major stories here. Of course, the battle for Speaker and what's happening in Israel now with reports that President Biden may be getting on Air Force One to make a visit to Israel this week. Let's bring you up to date on world and national news right now. Dan Schwartzman has more from the Bloomberg Newsroom in New York. Hi, Dan.
Thanks, Joe and Kaylee. Israel's saying Hamas is holding 199 hostages, including foreigners. The group Israeli Hostages and Missing Families Forum says the hostages are, quote, enduring extreme conditions. The group says some of the captives include children with autism, an elderly woman with Parkinson's disease, as well as a man with multiple sclerosis. Ahead of Tuesday's planned vote on the House floor to potentially elect Jim Jordan as House Speaker, the Ohio Republican was scrambling to shore up support with possibly upwards of 40 GOP members currently expected to vote no. Jordan says, let's get it done.
The way we can help the American people is get the House open. We can't do that till we get a speaker. So let's get a speaker tomorrow and get back to work for the American people and help our dear and closest friend, the state of Israel.
That's Congressman Jim Jordan. The staunch Donald Trump supporter picked up a key endorsement earlier today as House Armed Services Chairman Mike Rogers offered his support on X, formerly known as Twitter. Venezuela's government has agreed to talks with a faction of the opposition, which will allow the U.S. to ease sanctions on the country. Now, as part of the deal, the government of Nicolas Maduro will reportedly allow banned opposition candidates to run in the 2024 presidential election. All sides are expected to announce a preliminary agreement today, with talks to then be held in Barbados. The move is aimed at widening an agreement between the U.S. and Venezuela that would lift some sanctions on oil and banking. French authorities evacuating a high school in northern France after a bomb threat. The school in the Pas-de-Calais region of the country was the site of a deadly stabbing of a teacher by a suspected Islamic militant last week. A demining team was on site clearing the school. The country is on heightened alert after the stabbing as it fears other terror threats. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg. Back to Joe and Kaylee.
All right, Dan, we thank you. Let's review what we've learned here. This really, honestly, we come in to do a 2-hour broadcast every day, and we learn typically more than we end up reporting. Well, I guess we report what we learn, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. But you come in knowing more than you did when you entered.
Yes.
And today,
that is always the goal.
That's right, for all of us. Today we learned about a vote that's going to be, looks like noontime tomorrow. Of course, that could change at any moment, but I'm referring to the speaker's battle.
Yep.
And from the flippers that we've seen here, Kaylee, Jim Jordan might actually have the votes by the time that takes place.
Yeah, it's really not clear what his numbers are looking like right now. We know he was more than 50 votes short on Friday evening.
Yeah.
And yet we have seen a number. It seems like X post after X post after X post today coming out and saying, you know what? I'm with Jim Jordan, including a number of members we thought might not be. Mike Rogers, Ken Calvert, Ann Wagner. A lot of these defense appropriations talks, it seems like there's been some wheeling and dealing and promises being made, perhaps. It's just a question of whether or not that's enough to actually get him over the finish line. And by finish line, I mean gavel in hand.
Yeah, so this could be in process when we take air tomorrow. Maybe it'll be done. We'll see.
Yeah.
Of course, Sound On starts at 1 p.m. Eastern, so we'll see. Meanwhile, Joe Biden cancels a trip to Pueblo, Colorado today and might be, in fact, planning one. It appears he is planning one to go to Israel. We just don't know when.
Yeah, we're still waiting on firm timing, but of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has invited him. We've seen the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, make not one but 2 trips to Israel within the last week, as we are all watching very closely what's happening in Gaza, an attempted evacuation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians underway, conversations with the president around the humanitarian corridor. Unclear, Joe, whether or not any of it is working at this time as we wait to see if Israeli troops go marching in.
Yeah, that's right. And I wonder if that waits until after a Biden visit. We'll just have to wait and see. And then lastly, yet another reason why we want to both read the Mitt Romney book. I can't wait for this. This is the Romney A Reckoning that comes out in a week, right?
A week from Tuesday.
The headline from Axios today, Oprah pitched a White House run with Mitt Romney? Yes.
Not for this cycle.
No, it was back in 2020. And we'll be digging more into this. Hey, I'll meet you in Balance of Power later.
Sounds
Bloomberg
good.
Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. We're back from the West Coast. We made it.
We're so relaxed.
Survived a red eye.
Hey, it wasn't that bad.
It wasn't. We both passed out.
That's the only way to do it.
It is
It's a fake red eye, though. It's like 4.5 hours.
I know. It's barely a nap, to be quite honest. All right. It is Monday, October 16, 2023. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. We've got stocks rising, bonds falling, diplomatic efforts to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from expanding into a regional conflict. We're going to talk about that a lot this next 3 hours, Tim.
Yeah, we're going to be joined in just a few minutes by Major General, who's retired, Maston Robson, geopolitical intelligence advisor at Academy Securities. We spoke to him last week. He's going to be back with us this afternoon. We're also going to be speaking with Lior Susan, a former Special Forces agent with the Israeli military, on the long game of the Israeli-Hamas conflict.
Yeah, so much at stake here. Also, Wall Street strategists, they're sounding the alarm on worsening profit outlook. Remember, we are in earnings. What?
So far, so good, though.
Yeah, it's early.
S&P 500
It's
companies.
really early.
It's very early. You're right.
And it's all about how they've been talking down the numbers. So we're going to get into that. Who's not talking down the numbers? Anything and everything to do with Taylor Swift. We're going to talk about her raking it in over the weekend.
The Swift touch. Anything she touches absolutely turns to gold.
Exactly. We've also got a couple of tech stories on our radar. We're going to ask the question, are there some troubles for Apple? This is among our most read stories on the Bloomberg. It has to do with iPhone sales right over in China.
It's also moving shares of Apple lower today. Bloomberg exclusive talking about these two reports that show the iPhone 15 is just not selling as well as the iPhone 14.
Which, brings to mind a couple of issues that could be at play. So we're going to dig into it with our own Mark Gurman, who knows all things Apple. And then what about a zero ad version at Meta? Why not?
You know what they say?
What?
If it's free, you're the product.
Well, I'm just going to tell you, from what I understand, ads are all about the business over at Meta. So, how do you back away from it?
More than 98% of the company's revenue last quarter came from ads, Carol. So if they actually end up doing an ad-free version, they've got a lot of ground to make up.
Yeah, exactly. We're also going to check in with Julie Hansen. She's the CEO of the language learning platform Babbel. They are finding ways to fuel growth at the company. So we're going to get into it with her and see what she has to say. In the meantime, I'm looking at an equity market where we are up about 1.25% on the NASDAQ. So tech definitely an outperformer. You're up about 1% on the S&P 500 and the Dow just shy of a 1% gain. So we're going to be talking about the markets and more. We're going to head over to our TV colleagues. That's because Countdown to the Close starts now.
Countdown to the Close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the Countdown to the Close. Scarlett Fu and Bonnie Quinn here with you. Romaine Bossack and Katie Greifeld have the day off, but we are joined, as always, by our colleagues Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek. They are back from Los Angeles, back in the New York studios. And, of course, we welcome in full our Bloomberg audiences across television, radio, YouTube, and originals. How was L.A., guys?
It was incredible. The weather was unbelievable. And you know how you just kind of listed all these different platforms? That was a lot of what the conversations were about, right, Tim?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was all about delivering content, where people are, the rise of TikTok influencers, what old stalwarts like Netflix are going to do to try to gain growth as well.
Speaking of growth, we are definitely all about corporate profits. I feel like you guys and we are. Some of it has to do with Taylor Swift. We'll get into that. Maybe she's not corporate profits, but I feel like
she's profits for some people.
That's the secret to growth is just hire Taylor Swift to do everything.
Just put Taylor Swift in any press release that you're doing. Anyway, Wall Street strategists are coming out and they are sounding the alarm when it comes to corporate profits. What they're concerned about is a worsening profit outlook. So you had JP Morgan weakening revisions in terms of earnings revisions, the trends to the downside. And typically you see it maybe to the upside in this last quarter. But what's interesting is you're seeing that and you got to be a little bit worried about maybe corporate profits are going to be a little bit problematic, and then you have to think about what does that mean for asset valuations.
Okay, well, it kind of makes sense given all the headwinds, and to borrow a term that companies and analysts like to use. I apologize for that.
You're going to use guidance?
That companies are facing right now. So we got higher for longer interest rates, the yield on the 10-year hitting the highest in more than a decade. There are certainly still recession concerns. We have no idea, what high interest rates are going to do to the economy and if something is going to break as a result of Fed policy. And then, of course, the war taking place right now between Israel and Hamas. So there are a lot of unknowns out there. It'll be, notable to hear what companies have to say as we get to the heart of earnings season this week and next.
Well, certainly it's not impacting risk assets today, or at least perhaps the diplomatic efforts underway are helping the market today, but whether that maintains or not, we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, you're so right. We've been talking about it for the last couple of hours, this idea that analysts are upgrading their estimates for strategists are taking them down. So it's a real sort of tug of war between what market participants think
and how it all shakes out. And of course, we'll continue to break those earnings for you and give you the response in the markets. You mentioned Taylor Swift. We got to talk about that because the movie version of her concert stadium tour came out over the weekend. It was $96 million in North American ticket sales. That was a little bit less than what was expected, actually, $105 million to $145 million. It did not beat Barbie.
It didn't beat Barbie, but it was the best performing concert video ever, concert movie ever. So the last two, Justin Bieber and the Miley Cyrus one, they only had about a third of the revenue that this one did. But what I was fascinated by was the deal that she struck. She struck a deal with AMC, so she took out the middleman completely, as is her wont. Taylor has become fantastic at generating profits for herself, Carol.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing what, still 96 million sounds like a lot. It feels like a lot, 32 million internationally. What I want to do is I actually went on the Bloomberg and I was looking for different stories on her. And it says next to her, we have a description of who the person is, singer, songwriter, musician. And I feel like we have to update it to either mogul or tycoon or entertainment firm.
All three of those work.
Right, because everything she touches, she just brings so much enthusiasm. And, you think about what we did on the West Coast.
Yeah.
I mean, Taylor Swift came into so many of the conversations for anybody and everybody who is dealing with content
What was the
generation.
most surprising way in which she came into a conversation? Like who mentioned her that you wouldn't expect?
We spoke to the vice president of revenue, or the chief revenue officer, I should say, over at the Rams. Let's just say she was a little jealous that Taylor Swift was not, watching Rams games. I think it's fair to say that.
No, but I think even Ari Emanuel, I believe, he kicked it off and he said something like, "Oh, I'm glad to see you all are here because Taylor Swift just at the Grove opening up her movie because she's just such a draw with anything and everything she does."
Did you guys go to the show over the weekend? Did you go to have you seen the
I don't think I
theaters?
know enough of her songs to be able to go to that movie, and I mean I know a couple of them, but not enough to sing and dance through the whole
From what I saw on social media,
okay, we can't talk to you anymore.
you would have fun, but from what I saw on social, this is not like a movie where you sit down in the seats and you watch it. I mean, people are up at the screen like it's a concert, jumping up and down. I mean, it's like the concert experience without being there live.
Beyonce's up next, so get ready, everybody.
That's in December, right?
Exactly. Which is really, I almost think, the timing with the holidays. All right, we're going to come back. We'll talk maybe a little bit more Taylor, maybe a little bit of Beyonce, but we're definitely going to close up and wrap up the markets, the trading day. So join us at 4 p.m. Wall Street time, radio, TV, YouTube, and of course, Bloomberg Originals. We'll see you for Beyond the Bell. Our reporter writes today about how time is running out for the year of the bond on continuing losses. And then another reporter, editor, is here to talk about how rising bond correlations with stocks could be good for the S&P 500. She is Bloomberg News chief correspondent for global macro markets. We're talking about Liz McCormick. She's out there on Zoom in New Jersey. He is Bloomberg Markets senior editor, Mike Regan. He's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So love both sides that these two are coming at. First up, Liz, I want to start with you because let's set the scene for the bond market. We talk about it every day, rightfully so. It was supposed to be an up year, right? And then it's not. So give us the overview of the trade and why it really hasn't played out that way. And I'm assuming it's going to lead us to the Fed and rates.
Yes, and I was thinking this is the first story in a long time. I think I actually wrote the headline. It survived all you editors. Mike. Yeah.
Wow, I like this little peek behind the curtain in terms of understanding. So usually the headlines do not get changed a little bit, Liz. Is that what I'm sensing?
Maybe no.
Okay, well this is a good one. This is a good one. So congratulations.
Well, that way, Liz, you can always blame it on us if it's a bad one.
That's right. If it
we're
does
doing you a
poorly,
favor.
it's
You know, Liz was actually here at the office today, and then when she heard Mike Regan was coming on the show, like in person, she said, "I'm going to go work from home."
All right.
I couldn't handle it. I had to get out.
So the headline survives.
Near the bond, the headline survives. But you know, it's interesting, and I feel like I'm not just being nice because I came from the Wall Street side of things, but I will say, like, a lot of people got things wrong, but so did a lot of people in every market. And it was a tough one because, like, you know, Lacey Hunt, who I spoke to in the story, longtime veteran in the markets at Hoisington Management, smart guy, you know, they thought inflation would fall. And as we all know, it did, right? But that, you know, slowdown in the economy that everyone seemed to be forecasting, not everyone, but a lot, didn't happen, right? This kind of, even for the Fed, the resilience in the labor market has been surprising. So you had what seemed like a call that panned out, inflation fall, but a recession didn't happen. So that didn't help drive rates lower. Rates went higher. The Fed kept going on. And that we have this, like Stephen Major in our story talks about, and it's a fair point. Like years ago, and maybe I was one of them saying deficits are bad. No one seemed to care, right? And so he was saying it's weird that, you know, that really mattered. So the fiscal side weighed in, supply. So a lot of people who kind of like got the market wrong as far as rallying, their logic made sense, right? But a lot of things that seemed logical didn't pan out this year. Right?
Well, it's like we keep talking, Liz, about the recession, right? That's supposed to be coming, but we've been talking about it for at least 12 months, if not longer. We joke about when we were at Milken, like the last 2 years, everyone's like, the recession's coming, the recession's coming. Well, the recession hasn't come quite yet, right?
Exactly. And I can trump that. My son, who's 23, says, Mom, stop telling me the recession's coming. Because I kept telling him, get a job, quick, get a job. You know?
That's so funny. All right, Mike, come on in, because you highlight a story by Arlena Popina, which looks at the correlations between stocks and bonds, and you're specifically looking at volatility and yields and the big swings we've seen. Tell us about this and how it correlates with maybe the broader equity market.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting look at the bond market, and with the caveat that Liz will back me up on this. It's dangerous when
maybe
stock
not.
guys
You are an editor.
Talk about the bond market. But this was from a note from Dennis Deboucher, who's the chief market strategist at 22V Research. But he's a longtime strategist, very well known on Wall Street, and he looked at actually the correlation between yields and the MOVE index, which is an index of implied volatility in the options market on the bond market itself. And what he found is when that correlation is very high, in other words, when those two are moving almost in lockstep like they have been, that historically that has signaled top in yields, that the aggressive rise in yields is over, at least in the sort of short to near term. And that obviously bodes well for the equity market. The higher yields, higher interest rates, a more aggressive Fed has really been what spooked the equity market over the past few months. And it kind of gels and jibes with some other, people saying the same thing. BlackRock, for instance, came out today and saying they think, fingers crossed, probably, but the worst of the rise in yields looks like it could be over. I noticed Nicholas at Data Trek Research just had a tweet saying the same thing. So I think when you're wondering, well, how do we have this awful war start on a Saturday and then we end up with an S&P higher on the week, I think it is, guarded optimism that the spike in yields is nearing the end.
Liz, what do you make of that? I mean, what are your sources saying about this being the top? Because we've heard that song before.
Yeah, it is.
I feel like
I'll be honest.
I feel like Lucy and Charlie Brown again with the football.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say. First of all, Mike's right. Even a lot of the Wall Street rates research this week was warning things seem overdone. Maybe their yields can't go that much higher. But yeah, you kind of have to read that and say, oh, I've heard that before. So I don't know. But I think even like if we look at it, you guys have talked about this, the Fed speakers over the last week or so, for the first time, they kind of leaned in and said, maybe the rise in bond yields doing some of the work for us so we don't have to tighten as much. And I think that works to what Mike spoke overall, that maybe yields could be at, nearing the peak. That's kind of better for stocks because maybe the Fed is nearing done. All of this is like, we don't know. It could change. And I worry if we're all wrong and these Wall Street folks are wrong again and the inflation picks up or whatever it might be, that things have to plow on. It's going to be very tough for consumers, et cetera. But I think Mike's right. Right now, that seems to be the tone that maybe we've gone a little too far. Maybe the Fed is about done or is done. So we could have a reprieve here.
I'm always concerned, Mike, because you said that the indicator, it's shorter near term in terms of what it might mean of rates peaking out. And so it's really hard in this environment, right, to make long-term predictions. I think Doug Hass was on with the surveillance team, and he said something about right now it's really hard to manage money because the scenarios going forward are kind of wide and deep. Like you just said, the scope of the scenarios in terms of how this plays out from here, there's a lot out there.
Yeah, and I think sort of two-sided too. When you think of, that oil price increase that we saw a few weeks ago was very troubling from an inflation standpoint. And then you look at stuff like the UAW strike, the Kaiser medical strike, even the Hollywood and the writers strike. I mean, all that suggests further wage pressure that could make inflation linger on a little bit longer. To Liz's point, no one is pounding their fist on the table saying this is it, yields have peaked. It's a very cautious, guarded optimism. To me, I keep one eye glued on that oil price. I was convinced we'd see it back in the 90s after the tensions started heating up last week in Israel. It did go up. It sort of is leveled off, though, in the mid-80s. So that's one thing.
Maybe because at this point they don't think Iran has had any knowledge or advanced knowledge of the attack, and Iran, a bigger oil player.
Right. And we got through the weekend without it sort of spreading and escalating. There's heavy-duty diplomacy going on that fingers crossed maybe will bring some peace sometime soon. But it is all very tenuous and cautious at the moment.
Liz, we're going to get into a Fed blackout period in I think about 5 days. I think it's October 21st it starts, I think. Is that a good or bad thing, you think, for markets, for the Fed speakers to just kind of lay low for a while?
Well, first we got to get through Chairman Powell, who I think is Thursday.
That's right. There is that big one.
The big kahuna. Yeah. So I'm curious what he has to say, if he kind of leans in with the other folks.
What would you ask him? What would be top of mind? First, you only have one question. You got 30 seconds right now, by the way. What would be that question?
I would ask him, isn't it risky to kind of tie policy outlook on, this nebulous long-term treasury rate? I know they're saying they're looking at financial conditions because what if yields tumble, and that ignites the stock market? And then, financial conditions, I just kind of wonder, even though I'm a bond person, there was a lot of talk on the long-term yields rising that has done it for us. And, is it a risky policy to focus too much on where yields are going to filter into your policy? That's what I wonder. Yeah.
All right. Well, good stuff. Guys, thank you so much. Bloomberg News Chief Correspondent for Global Macro Markets, Liz McCormick in New Jersey on Zoom. And, of course, Bloomberg Markets Senior Editor Mike Regan right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Our thanks to both of you. We're just getting started on this Monday. Carol Massar, Tim Stanovic, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We check the markets all day long. I'm Steve Rappaport. This update brought to you by Glenn Mead. Glenn Mead offers sophisticated wealth and investment management solutions combined with the personalized service you deserve. Your wealth, your mission, your investments. Let's talk. Visit glenmead.com to learn more. Checking the markets with less than an hour to go before the bell, we are up on the big three. The S&P 500 up more than 1%. Same goes for the Dow. The NASDAQ leading the pack, up more than 1.3%. Two-year yield 5.09, the 10-year 4.70. COMEX gold trading at $1,932.40 an ounce. NYMEX crude down more than 1% now. It's at $86.75 a barrel. The price topped $87 a barrel on Friday as concerns grew about the war between Israel and Hamas escalating further into areas of the region. Japanese yen is at 149.54, the euro 10559, British pound 12218. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. Steve Rappaport in for Charlie Pellet on this Monday. Just looking at our most read on the Bloomberg, we are doing a daily update, if you will, on the Israel-Hamas conflict.
That's always at the top of the most read.
It always is, right? And Israel's defense minister telling the U.S. to brace for a, quote, long war against Hamas as Secretary of State Antony Blinken returned to Israel for further talks amid a global push to prevent the conflict from spreading. President Joe Biden is also considering a visit. So we keep hearing all of this from our news team as well, but that seems to be among the latest.
I think it's really notable what Mike Regan said a few moments ago about all of the diplomacy going on behind the scenes and you know, not just behind the scenes, but in front of everyone right now with Blinken back there trying to prevent this from spreading into something bigger.
All right, so let's talk about that because that's something Tim and I have talked about a lot since this conflict broke out with us, and so appreciative to have back with us Major General Mastin Robison, geopolitical intelligence geopolitical intelligence advisor to the Academy Securities Advisory Board. He's on Zoom from Greenville, South Carolina. The general served about 34 years on active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps. He served in more than 60 countries, and that includes Liberia, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and he did command at every operational level in the Marine Corps. Major General, thank you so much for being with us. How does what comes next determine so much longer term here?
Thanks, Carol. Tim, great to be with you. Without a doubt, there's going to be an assault. Without a doubt, Israel is going to go after Hamas with every intent of destroying them. That's not going to be easy because although they have a pretty good intelligence base of what's in Hamas, where the tunnels are, where the buildings are, getting after that without significant collateral damage is going to be really brutal. So I think what we're going to see is they are trying right now their best to set up their options to make sure that they have as many partners and as much latitude as they can. But at the end of the day, the interesting part will be how much will Hamas be able to hold down? How much will Iran or Hezbollah come in to help them?
Well, talk to us about what you believe is happening behind the scenes right now from a diplomatic standpoint, because it seems like the U.S. is doing everything it can to prevent this conflict from spiraling out of control.
I think the U.S. is doing everything they can to ensure. I don't think the U.S. has any illusions that the conflict isn't going to happen. So what they're trying to do is mitigate the side effects and whether it spins right or less. How does this influence our opportunity or our relationship with Russia, with Turkey? How does it influence the Middle East relationship? Where does Saudi stand on this? Is Egypt willing to come on board with the Abraham Accords and be supportive? Or does the Brotherhood start to influence Egypt to take a little more empathetic position towards Hamas? So there's certainly a lot of dynamics here that we're trying to shore those up. Nobody knows what Syria's going to do, what Lebanon's going to do, what Iran's going to do, what Egypt's going to do. But we do know what Israel's going to do. So it's how do we shore up the unknowns, how to create as much stability as possible while you still can. Once the shooting starts, it's really hard to negotiate.
General Robinson, The thing, though, I mean, does Israel have a choice to not attack? Not really.
No.
And why? I mean, I understand in terms of the severity of what has happened. But why do they not? For those who might be asking that question.
I think if you consider that Hamas was established in 1987 and grew out of, that last rebellion, it was unsuccessful. They've been in control of Gaza since 2007, whether that was by force or by democratic process. It authorized and empowered them. And the fact that they have taken 50% of their ground force, of their trained jihadists, and put them into the fight. They've never shot 2,500 rockets in a single day before. And without a doubt, planning for this had to have had some outside influence. We just can't confirm yet exactly who that was. If Israel doesn't take a step here, Hamas will see this as a sign of weakness, and all it will do is embolden them to do more. There's no way Hamas steps back from this at this point.
Unfortunately, we've seen many civilians on the Israeli side as well as in Gaza killed already. Major General, how do we prevent more deaths? What does Israel need to do to prevent more deaths?
I think Israel's going to try to be as surgical as they possibly can be, but it's going to be
That's
very
hard
difficult.
in Gaza, where it's one of the most densely populated places in the world.
It is, and it's particularly hard when you don't have bunker busting bombs, which they're hoping we're going to give them. That's a deep dive down to a whole lot of cement to be able to get to it.
When you said that Hamas had to have had some kind of outside assistance, do you not yet rule out that Iran had a role in this, even though intelligence so far, I believe we even heard that from the president, I think on 60 Minutes last night, that so far that there's no signs that Iran has had a hand in assisting Hamas? Do you think the jury's still out on that?
Yes and no. I think for diplomatic reasons, the president is being very wise not to make accusations he can't prove. But I think anybody sitting on the sidelines with any kind of history in this absolutely sees Iran's fingerprints on this, and that they are all over the money they've been flowing into Hamas for the last 5 years. And you consider nothing's really happened in 5 to 7 years. That really is the time that Hamas lulled Israel to sleep, thinking maybe they are legitimately going to put more emphasis on their political influence than on their rebellious and on their desire to destroy Israel. Well, that proved to be untrue. And it was a false sense of security that Israel fell into. That's the reason that they can't afford, with this kind of buildup, just let it go.
What do you think when the world does understand forces that perhaps helped Hamas?
Mm-hmm.
What should the reaction be? Because we've seen war, prolonged war in the region before, and it never ends well.
It will be divisive. I think that those who believe that what Hamas did was unconscionable will side with Israel, and those who believe that the state of the Palestinian nation is also reprehensible. What they have suffered through will support them. So there'll be a division, without a doubt. The question is, where does Saudi land? Where does Egypt land? Where does Qatar land? Where does UAE land in that debate? If they are willing to go, wait a minute, this is a jihadist type movement. This is not the Palestinian people, and we're going to, in essence, either stay neutral or we're going to give at least tacit support to the Abraham Accords, in theory. Then I think that's a whole different set of circumstances if everybody unifies behind Hamas. I don't really see Saudi and Egypt rallying behind Hamas in this. Keep in mind, Saudi is as paranoid and afraid of Iran as anybody else is. So the last thing that I see them doing is creating some kind of partnership with Iran long term.
Do you ultimately see a ceasefire at some point in the near future? And I'm just curious if you think about this in terms of if you have a specific time frame where you think Israel does what Israel has to do and then things calm down and then people try to figure out the way forward.
Yeah, we generally think of decision cycles in this as is it effects-based or time-based? This is definitely an effects-based decision cycle where Israel will say, I'm only going to pause when I think that I've had the initial effects that I want to have. It'll have nothing to do with time. It'll have everything to do with effects.
Well, we always so appreciate your insight and your time once again. So thank you so much for joining us. Major General Mastin Robison, Geopolitical Intelligence Advisor to the Academy Securities Advisory Board, understands battles, having served over 34 years active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps. But, you know, I was struck by something that our Lisa Beyer writes, Tim, and she says, quote, the struggle between Arabs and Jews over ownership of the Holy Land dates back more than a century and has given rise to 7 major wars. Of course, the latest broke out October 7th, which is what we are talking about now. So my question is, how do we get this struggle to stop ultimately?
I mean, this has been a defining characteristic of the Middle East during our lifetimes. And the sad part is I don't see how it ends anytime soon.
No. And we appreciate, though, the Major General weighing in. We're going to have another voice with an interesting and unique perspective a little bit later on this conflict coming up a little bit later on.
Let's now get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Dan Schwartzman in the Bloomberg 1130 newsroom here in New York. Hey, Dan.
Thanks, Carol and Tim. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu having to take shelter in a bunker in Tel Aviv as sirens blared warnings of a rocket attack. Blinken is in Israel for the second time in a week after also visiting 6 Arab countries. President Biden is considering visiting the country as well, the U.S. pushing to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from spreading further in the Middle East. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz expected in the region starting tomorrow. He will visit Israel and then head on to Egypt. Meanwhile, Israel continues to urge Gaza City residents to move south as it announces the opening of another safe corridor for a limited time. The IDF says it will refrain from targeting the designated area to allow a safe evacuation. So far, an estimated 600,000 or so Gazans have left North Gaza. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says on Good Morning America that the Biden administration officials have told Israel to make sure to protect civilians.
We obviously are keeping in touch with our Israeli counterparts literally every day, if not by the hour, and continue to stress to them that it's really important that innocent civilian lives be protected, that humanitarian assistance can get in.
That's National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. Israel massing close to 300,000 troops along the border with Gaza. A settlement has been reached between the federal government and the lawyers representing thousands of families who had been separated at the southern border of the U.S. during the Trump administration. The migrants will be allowed to stay in the country and apply for asylum, which will put them on a path to permanent legal residency as part of the deal. The government has agreed to also refrain from similar separations for 8 years. Between 2017 and 2021, an estimate of close to 4,000 kids were separated from their families. Not all have yet to be reunited. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We now go over to the First Word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here's Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon. Stocks with a bid today from the start, with the Dow currently up 330 points. S&P's gained 48, and NASDAQ is higher by 1.3%. The U.S. 10-year yield at 4.71%. Gold is down 13. Oil is in the red, but Bitcoin soared as much as 10% before pairing gains. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, all were trading in the green, led by gains in consumer discretionary and telecom. And leaders to the upside in the Dow, Nike and Salesforce. Fractional losses in JP Morgan and Boeing. After earnings, Schwab jumped 4.6%. And in other news, BlackRock said their ETF application is still under review by the SEC. Wrapping things up, Moderna fell as much as 8.3% to its lowest level since November 2020. Live from the First Word breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney.
Thanks, Bill. To hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type SQUA on your Bloomberg terminal.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
The funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, just have about 18 minutes left in today's trading session. Getting ready to wrap up the Monday trade. We've got stocks. They're up for the day. It's really interesting to see. I don't know.
Okay,
I don't
you're
know
not
that
the
I
only
call,
one.
right? And just
look at yields, too.
Some calm, if you will, in the markets, despite all the geopolitical stuff.
I can't explain it, but maybe we know someone who can. Cole Smead is CEO and portfolio manager at Smead Capital Management. He joins us on Zoom from Phoenix, Arizona. We should note, Carol, the Smead Value Fund's got about $4.5 billion in assets under management. It's outperformed its peers over the past 5 years, returning an average annually more than 11%. This year, the fund, though, is up just about 2%.
Hey, Cole, good to have you back with us. It's an interesting world. First macro, and then we love to talk names with you, but the macro environment, it does feel like there's some calm, certainly on the U.S. equity trade, despite our focus on what's going on in Israel and elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of questions out there on so many different levels. How do you see the macro environment?
Yeah, Carol, I was rewatching for probably the 10th time in my life Gone with the Wind yesterday. It was just kind of one of those things I did on a Sunday, and I actually think Mr. Market's a lot like Scarlett O'Hara. She said, fiddle-dee-dee, all this talk of wars ruining my spring party. That's what equity investors are treating as. It's not that big of a deal. They also are treating what's going on in the bond market with the rise in the 10-year yield and the 30-year yield as though it's really not that big of a deal to them, much like Scarlett did prior to the Civil War breaking out. And that's a lot of danger. It just shows you how the psychology really hasn't woken up to the new world we're in, the post-pandemic world, where obviously things are not a given and cheap money is gone. And so the question, to your point, is when will people rectify those things in their mind? We're just not there yet.
So what do you think of where we are in the S&P 500? Are you saying the S&P 500 and equity investors today are not taking into account how many headwinds we face?
It's a great question, Tim. And since we're of the same kind of cohort, millennial-wise, I think about it like this. In our lifetimes, are we going to see as cheap and super easy of money as we had, and in just a cute little adorable bear market in stocks of 22%? And that's how you clean up major euphorias in capital markets? No, it never ends like that. It always ends in having to really take the psychology to dire straits where people question whether they want to own stocks again. So, we look at this as this is kind of like this was just the next part of the bear market. People got really excited about a few companies again and took the S&P higher, while most stocks are doing poorly. And our best guess, again, this is not where we make our money, but our best guess is, in the end, peak to trough, the S&P will probably have to lose at least 30, if not 35% of its market value before you clean up the psychology.
Over what time period?
You just got to do it. In other words, to your point, Tim, we're a little over a year into the bear market, and a 22% decline didn't cause people to change their mind, ask the question, are we in a new era? Whether we're talking, the geopolitical risks that have now woken up. I mean, to invert that, we know that this, as you guys do, that this benefit that the S&P is getting is a very, very narrow group of stocks. In comparison, the businesses that benefit from what's gone on in Israel in the last week is a lot of oil companies, and yet those are a tiny part of the S&P. So you kind of have to ask the question, who wins, who loses in this new regime? And are investors really pricing in the winners and losers correctly? We don't think so at all.
So you're basically saying, and you expect equities will fall substantially from here, or they need to fall to kind of fully reflect maybe the macro?
Well, I would say when I say equities, I'm talking about the S&P 500. So to your point, Carol, I'm talking about the composition of what it owns. Does that mean all stocks have to do poorly? No, not at all. Just like if you look at the equal weighted or the Russell 2, they're doing much worse than the S&P 500 is from a total return perspective. So it just shows you, the exciting stocks, the big market caps out there, that has to struggle for the S&P to do poorly. And so it's you go out and shoot 5 or 10 stocks out back, and you're going to change the S&P for a long time.
All right, so let's talk about what's in your portfolio. You do have a bunch of energy names. As of the end of August, I was looking at the holdings that we saw. Occidental was in there. ConocoPhillips was in there. I don't see Shell in that list, and we had that stock hitting an intraday high over in London today. Of course, they just bought Pioneer, a massive $60 billion bet on shale. It's a big reminder that fossil fuels, at least from the big integrated oil companies, they're still betting on it, that it's going to be around for a while. But why not Shell?
Well, so Shell has been coming out of what I call the European major problem, which is that you wanted to have a lot of fun at the Parisian cocktail parties and parties in Europe, and selling oil and gas stories is not what the European majors have been interested in. In comparison, we're starting to see like the Exxon Mobil's out there wanting to do their Pioneer deal. So if the majors wake up wanting to do deals, I think we have a very different world in the energy space, because there's a lot of producers that could be acquired for attractive multiples on an all stock deal, like is going on with the Exxon Pioneer deal. So if Shell wants to become a U.S. company like they flirted with in the Financial Times a few months ago, they could be a deal maker at this time. It looks like BP and Total are the less likely one to do that. But again, I think you have to compare the return on equity. If you look at Shell, it's a mid-teens return on equity story. Mm-hmm. It's trading cheaper than some of the other names among the American majors. But that's because they're also wasting a good amount of money in their renewables. That's why their returns are not 20% return on equity now.
And forgive me, as you said, it was Exxon buying Pioneer, which is what I meant to say. Interesting.
Hey, Cole, let's go from oil to retail, because you're a big, you guys have a big position in Target, down 25% so far this year. You have a market value of hundreds of millions of dollars invested in Target. Give me your thoughts on Target, especially in the wake of what they did with closing stores, what they said was due to shrink.
Yeah, some of that is just what's going on in society. To your point about I'll call it vandalism, I'll call it crime, etc. But I think another thing that has to be said is this got here not by accident, but by also leadership. So, for example, I know with what the culture wars has gone on at Target, there's been talk of what certain groups felt they were hurt by and whatnot. I think you also have to look at the employees though too. So you have all this crime going on in, particularly urban Target centers, and then you add the culture war into where these employees are getting harassed by things that they have no control over. I think it's a big mark against the current management. I would say Brian Cornell's made a lot of missteps. If you look at some of the culture war stuff that I'm commenting on, you just don't see that talked about with Walmart. So I think they've taken unique risks that have disadvantaged them in this season. At the same time, they benefited so much from COVID that I think some of this is also just, reacting to a more normal environment. They're not selling as many TVs as they did a year or 2 years ago. And those were just big ticket price items for Target. So we look at Target, it's a 25% to 30% return on equity story. Tim, they were earning as much as 40 to 50% return on equity, which just wasn't sustainable. They were over earning in a lot of respects.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Hey, Cole, thank you so much for joining us. Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager at Smead Capital Management, joining us on Zoom from Phoenix, Arizona. Just got about 10 minutes left in the trading session, bouncing around a little bit, but still just off our best levels of the session, meaning more than
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Steve Rappaport. Shares of Shell closed at a record high as rising energy prices and the new CEO's focus on oil and gas got investors' attention. We get more from Bloomberg's Laura Hurst in London.
Someone I spoke to today said you have to be careful about the cult of CEO. You know, you can't really pin it down to one person. And if you do look back, oil prices and gas prices have obviously recovered from those pandemic lows that really suppressed Shell's share price. But I think investors are taking to this new strategy, which is focusing more on oil and gas, which is Shell's bread and butter. Even though it's dipped its toe into renewables, the bulk of its money still comes from oil and gas, and that's helping it right now.
That's Bloomberg's Laura Hurst in London. Ford calls on the United Auto Workers Union to end its strike. Bloomberg's Joan Doniger reports.
Steve, Executive Chair Bill Ford says it's time for both parties to come together to bring an end to what he calls this acrimonious round of talks. The union began its walkout on September 15th after a 4-year contract expired, targeting plants run by Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. UAW President Shawn Fain called a surprise strike last week at Ford's truck plant in Kentucky. The union's decision to stop work at Ford's largest factory was a major escalation since that site makes higher-priced Super Duty versions of F-Series pickups and Lincoln Navigator and Ford Expedition large SUVs. Steve?
Thanks, Joan. Shares of Ford are up more than 1%. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, under 5 minutes left to go in the Monday trading session. We're going to head over to Scarlett and Vonnie in just a moment, and we'll wrap up the trading day. In the meantime, love this story. It's so funny. Our producer, our YouTube producer, Ariagami, always kind of shares with us some interesting stories that are on his radar, and we kind of go back and forth. And I was just kind of looking because crypto kind of had a spike earlier in the day.
Yeah, there was a little confusion over something. I don't quite know what's going on.
Wait a minute. It's on Ari's list as well. After months of declining Bitcoin, or I should say declining volatility when it comes to the Bitcoin trade, Bitcoin traders saw some of the wildest price swings that they've seen in a while when a false report circulated around saying, the U.S. had approved a long-awaited ETF, exchange-traded fund.
This is not the first time a false report has come out and moved the price of crypto.
Maybe they need
but
a
that's a story
blockchain to maybe
for,
keep it pure.
Don't even get me started. A story for a different day. We saw Bitcoin jump more than 10% to $30,000 around 9:30 this morning, only to be cut, or the gain was cut by more than half just a few minutes later. This after BlackRock came out and said that its application for an ETF that invests directly in the cryptocurrency is still under review. We should note that intraday move that we saw earlier today was the largest since March.
It just shows that everybody's kind of waiting. Kind of a lot of investors are interested potentially in this ETF and hope for, this spot Bitcoin product, if you will. Regulators, though, in the past have refused to allow it, and it sounds like you got to still wait a little bit longer.
Yeah, the SEC has cited market manipulation, among other reasons, for not granting an endorsement. However, the incident also serves as a reminder that Bitcoin's price can easily be moved by gossip, by hearsay.
Wait, there's
by
volatility?
Press releases that have come out.
It could swing up really high?
I remember seeing a press
happen?
release like 2 years ago for, it was something involving Litecoin and a retailer accepting Litecoin, and that caused a lot of confusion because it looked like a legit press release. It was bad news.
There are currently more than 10 filings for spot Bitcoin ETFs, with industry heavyweights like BlackRock and Invesco being part of that race. So, and people, I think when kind of the establishment gets involved, that maybe there's more likelihood that it happens, and it might be greater this time around.
There are players who are involved in, those ads are all over JFK. I don't know if you saw them.
That's so funny. I walk off the PATH train this morning.
Ads are everywhere.
World Trade. Huge.
Grayscale?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
A lot of money on marketing.
All right, everybody, don't go anywhere. We're going to count you down to the close on this Monday. Beyond the Bell starts right now.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
We are about 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Scarlett Fu and Bonnie Quinn here, counting you down to the closing bell, and here to help us take you beyond the bell with the global simulcast, Carol Massar and Tim Stenovic back from Los Angeles. And of course, welcome to our Bloomberg Television, radio, and YouTube audiences worldwide as we look through the day, the trading day. It's a good day if you're long on risk. And Carol and Tim, Monday is apparently a very good day for U.S. stocks, and this Monday is no exception.
Yeah, kind of interesting, right, considering everything that's going on in the world. And an interesting day where there's a fair amount of volatility when it comes to Bitcoin. Like, okay, we have an ETF. We don't have an ETF. Like, it's interesting to see kind of the news flow and depending on the asset class, because when I'm looking at Bitcoin, went up as much as 30,000. We're now at 28, went as low as 27. So talk about some really extreme swings. Tim and I were just talking about it. It's just kind of a wacky day overall.
Yeah, that move, the biggest move since March. I have to say, I'm a little puzzled by the moves in the equity market that we're seeing today, given that we have so much Fed speak to hear this week, and we have to hear from so many companies in the S&P 500 that are set to report earnings. We're going to hear from Jay Powell later this week. I will say we did speak to Cole Smead, the president and CEO over at Smead Capital Management, a little earlier today. He was pretty bearish on the indices. I mean, he's a stock picker, so take it with a grain of salt, but he does think that because the S&P 500 has been powered this year by just a handful of companies, those magnificent seven as they've been dubbed, he thinks it's going to fall sharply from here, double digits.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, the bifurcation of opinions here. We'll definitely know in a few weeks what happens in the quarter, but you do have to wonder if today's risk on isn't just sort of a flight to the quality of U.S. assets in general with so much uncertainty in the world.
And a reflection, perhaps, of the fact that the worst has not yet happened. A ground war has not begun in Gaza, although plenty of people say that that is still kind of the assumption that something will happen. There you have the closing bells. You have gains of at least 1% for the S&P and the NASDAQ. The S&P 500 gaining 1.1%, 45 points. I believe this marks the 15th straight Monday that the S&P 500 has closed higher. The NASDAQ Composite Index gaining about 1.2%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average is the laggard, sort of, gaining only 0.9%.
Yeah, and digging a little bit deeper into the S&P 500, Scarlett, I mean, you've got most names in the S&P 500 higher today, 459 to be exact, 43 to the downside, and just one unchanged.
Okay, this is, I don't know how often this happens because I don't really recall seeing this too often, but if you slice up the S&P 500 into 24 industry groups, guess what? Everything is green.
Look at that.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Retail, transportation, media, entertainment, they lead the way up at least 1.5%. Retail up by more than 2%. Tech, hardware, banks, and energy are the laggards, but they're still in the green, as you can see.
All right, so let's get to some of the green. I had so much to choose from, apparently, then. Pfizer was atop my list, though. It was up about 3.6%. Wacky day, right? We got some news after the close on Friday that took the stock down. This is after the company slashed per share adjusted earnings expectations to $1.45 a share to $1.65 a share. That was, again, Friday night. And this had to do, they also made an agreement with the government. They're going to take back 8 million doses of Paxlovid this year. That maybe has some upside to it because it means then they can actually sell it and make more money off of the product versus keeping it in the U.S. government stockpile. So nonetheless, Pfizer definitely an outperformer in today's session. Charles Schwab saw that atop the S&P 500 throughout the day. The firm reported bank deposits for the third quarter that beat the average analyst estimate. Adjusted earnings per share beat estimates. Analysts were pretty positive on the company's September trends. The company, $46 billion garnered, or gathered, I should say, in core net new assets, including $27 billion in September. So just the amount of money coming into Schwab, and you saw that stock up about 4.7%. Lululemon, number one in the NASDAQ 100, got some news late Friday also that it's going to be put into the S&P 500, replacing Activision Blizzard. So you've got that stock up 10%. And I just want to mention Dexcom, because this was trading high among the S&P 500 and NASDAQ, up about 3.6%. It makes glucose monitoring systems for those with diabetes. Coverage initiated with Outperform and $110 share price target over at Leerink Partners. So that stock closing at just below $80 a share.
All right, you got the gainers. It was actually not that difficult for me to find decliners, though. Apple barely holding on to its declines today, falling just 7/100ths of 1%. I'm going to go ahead and round that up to down 0.1 of 1%. It was down earlier as much as 1.1%. This after Bloomberg reported two separate analyses, Scarlett, that showed the iPhone 15 is just not selling as well as the iPhone 14 did over the same period of time in China. Down 4.5% compared with the iPhone 14 over the first 17 days after release. That's according to the market tracker Counterpoint Research. We should note Apple has not come out and said anything about these sales thus far. Separately, Jefferies analysts said that the sales of the iPhone 15 were down by an even sharper double-digit percentage versus the iPhone 14. Still, Apple barely closing in the red today, down just about 0.1%. Let's look at shares of Moderna. Carol talked about Pfizer and the challenges that Pfizer talked about on Friday. Well, shares of Moderna were the ones taking the hit as a result today. The company touched a 3-year low even after the company reaffirmed its COVID-19 vaccine revenue forecast for the full year. Shares of Moderna fell late Friday after Pfizer slashed its profit outlook amid waning demand for COVID treatments. We should note that Moderna still anticipates it will have improved visibility about the expected U.S. market size after seeing full vaccination trends through October of 2023 when people go out and get vaccinated throughout this month. And if the U.S. market for COVID-19 vaccines is approximately 50 million administered doses, then Moderna still does expect to be in the bottom half of the disclosed range. And then Vista Outdoors shares, ticker VSTO, not for long, finishing it down by 24% today. Largest single-day drop since 2020. This after the company came out and cut its sales guidance for the full year. Now, separately, the company also said it's selling its ammunition business to a Czech arms conglomerate. It's a $1.9 billion deal. Instead, the company's going to, from now on, focus on sports and outdoor equipment. That deal is expected to close in May of next year. As a result, Vista Outdoors is going to change its name to Revelist. It also trade under the ticker Revelist, yeah.
What does that even mean?
I think it means get outside and buy some gear. The ticker is going to be GEAR. And it's going to have the brands Fox, Bell, Giro, Camelback. These are all, some good cycling brands that I like. I'm a cyclist. Yeah. Bushnell, the binoculars, Sims Fishing, Foresight Sports, Bushnell Golf, and more. So they're going to focus on outdoors and then golf and camping as well.
I'm always puzzled by company names and how sometimes they're completely made up.
I bet a consultant was paid a lot to come up with that name, Scarlett.
I'm guessing as well.
Maybe
All right.
a group of them.
Let's go through
focus groups, and they're all like, "Oh, great name, great name."
Yes,
not so much.
Let's go through treasuries really quickly. There's only one name for them: U.S. government debt. U.S. treasuries, you could see there, yields moving up, price down, yields higher, and the 2-year currently above 5%, 5.09%. The 10-year moving up to 4.708%. We've seen some big moves of late. This is also yet another big move. Certainly more movement on the long end of the yield curve than on the shorter end, continuing that trend that we've seen over the last couple of days.
Yeah, much more movement on the long end, which is really interesting. And at one point, will this make the curve disinvert? Stephen Major was on this morning on Bloomberg saying that, yeah, that'll happen, but whether it's because of the short end or the long end, it remains to be seen.
I'm done debating Fed policy and interest rates because they're just going to happen. What I'm really into is what's going on in terms of earnings this week, because you've got Goldman Sachs, Bank of America tomorrow. We've got American Airlines. You've got, I'm looking at my list, Netflix, Tesla,
Netflix.
Right, American Express. I feel like what we get in terms of commentary, what we get in terms of outlook will maybe help us in terms of figuring out what the rest of the picture is in terms of the economy, corporate profits, and maybe ultimately what the Fed has to do.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you think investors will be more discerning this time around when it comes to companies talking up their AI prospects as opposed to what they're actually doing? Because in the last couple of quarters, that was enough to get everyone excited. But at this point, it's a little bit more like you have to show me something now.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really good point. I think we want to see what kind of visibility you have. And is, visibility, Vonnie, is it good, upbeat, thinking about the rest of the year and really going into the next year?
Well, and as we've seen, it may not be AI, but certainly the conference calls have been extremely, important in investor reaction. And what will the conference calls, what will their sort of common theme be this time? And will it have something to do with the Middle East? That's one of the things that could definitely terrify investors. So you sort of wonder, will executives go there?
In terms of what we have coming tomorrow, I'm perhaps most interested in Bank of America. Bank of America has such a good read on the U.S. consumer, really good understanding of what consumers are spending their money on, and the consumer powers this economy. So I'm going to be listening to what Moynihan has to say about the strength of the U.S. consumer.
And
good tease.
Stay tuned because we'll hear it on Bloomberg.
Brian Moynihan says, thank you, Tim. We've also got retail sales coming up tomorrow, so don't forget, we'll check them out in the morning. All right, that's a wrap. Our cross-platform coverage, radio, TV, YouTube, and of course, Bloomberg Originals. We will all see you again tomorrow.
It makes us harder, better, faster, stronger. That don't kill me, can only make me stronger. I need you to hurry up now.
All right. right, everybody. As we mentioned, Goldman Sachs reporting earnings tomorrow morning before the U.S. Opens. It is expected to post its 8th straight quarter with a profit drop. And we've got a story that is among the most read on the Bloomberg today, and it's written by our own Sri Natarajan.
Yeah, Sri reports on the company's Mark Nachman and his crucial mission to help juice Goldman's stock. Sri's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. So who are we talking about here, Sri?
You know, this is an executive who's not really in the spotlight much, but I'd argue, and many people inside the firm have told me, that he's possibly the third most important person at Goldman Sachs right now.
Carol, had you heard of him before this story? Be honest.
No.
Neither had I, and I'm glad you said no.
I blame you guys for not reading my stories ever, but that's a separate
hey,
point.
no, we read your stories all the time.
We read. The reality is we all know about the CEO, David Solomon, and his deputy, John Waldron. It's really been the two of them atop Goldman Sachs. But of all the people under them, Mark Nachman's an interesting person just because he's the only executive who's run every single important division at that firm: investment banking, trading, and now this asset and wealth management division. And here's the reason we're even looking at him right now. We've all seen the noise around Goldman Sachs, all the dissatisfaction in the ranks, and the perception, the scrutiny on the CEO, David Solomon. But he's not going anywhere for now. The board's pretty much come out and given its public nod of support. The question is, what will be David Solomon's legacy? If he were to leave today, I don't think anyone's necessarily giving him an 8+ rating just because of everything we've seen happen at the firm in the last year or two. What could change, though, is if Goldman is able to pull off this pivot, build out this money management division, that's its asset and wealth management division, a $2.7 trillion business right now. But if it can do what they're trying to achieve, which is deliver predictable revenue, grow management fee, wind down their balance sheet investments, which are a drag on the equity capital, and therefore a drag on ROE, which is an important metric for investors. If they're able to do all that, grow this well, then it's entirely possible that shareholders will embrace the stock in a manner, in a fashion that they already do for JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. And to put a fine point on it, if you look at the price to book ratio, technical, but still an important metric, Goldman's still trading roughly below price to book, which is if the firm were to be liquidated and sum of all its assets, the market is valuing it less than what the company says it's worth. Morgan Stanley is at about 1.5 times. JP Morgan is a little higher than that. The difference? The Goldman Sachs stock today, which is worth $310, if it were to get the Morgan Stanley multiple, that would be about $450. That's a big gulf. And that's the gulf Solomon wants to bridge. And that's where Mark Nachman plays a crucial role.
So the market's right in terms of its undervaluation or lower valuation, if you will, because Goldman needs to do things to kind of shake up its business and provide more value. Is that right?
The market's never right or wrong. It is what it is, right? Goldman would argue that the market's not rightly valuing its core, which is its investment bank. We all know its prowess in trading. We all know its prowess in investment banking and deal making, and it has been gaining market share there. They would argue that that business perhaps deserves a higher multiple than the market's rewarding it. They also think that their asset and wealth management division has been performing well enough for several years that it should be heaped with a higher multiple.
So why isn't the market? Why isn't the market, though, then giving it that higher valuation?
It doesn't believe Goldman can do it again and again and again. In fact, analysts say Goldman's earnings remain too volatile. Every 3 months, it's a reset.
Right.
When you come to think about Goldman Sachs earnings, because you have to wonder what is happening in the investment banking markets last 3 months, next 3 months, what happened with trading, and what is the other leg of the stool, asset and wealth management division, which did post fairly volatile numbers because Goldman had big principal bets on its balance sheet. So when markets go up, those bets go up, and that flows straight through to earnings. When the markets go down, you also get a bit of a big hit. Some would argue that's been the bank's secret sauce. You know, you have those occasional losses, but they were overshadowed by frequent windfalls. Yet investors like consistency and predictability that they were not getting with Goldman Sachs, and therefore you could argue they're punishing Goldman with the multiple that they have on Goldman Sachs stock right now.
We'll certainly get an update on the financials when Goldman Sachs reports early tomorrow, Sri. I know you'll be up early covering that. I do want to know about Mark Nachman as a person, because anyone who's read about Goldman Sachs over the last few years, and especially over the last few months, has a pretty good idea of at least the way that David Solomon has been portrayed in the media and a good understanding of his personality. Who is this Goldman lifer?
Not a very public person. He's been at the firm since 1994. So
That's stark contrast to the CEO.
That's actually true. In fact, he's been at the firm longer than the CEO, but that's perhaps true of almost all the other division heads. When you think about the trading heads, when you think about the banking heads, David Solomon is the rare person atop Goldman who actually is a lateral hire, if you may. He came over from Bear Stearns and brought over John Waldron with him soon after. Nachman has been there since 94. He's 53 right now. He's gotten all the important divisions. And, we point out in the story, this is also not the first time he's necessarily wrestling with a challenge that could be consequential to the stock price. Early on in his career, when he was still a junior banker, as a junior banker, he was part of a group, part of a project studying whether Goldman Sachs should even go public. If you remember, Goldman Sachs went public in 1999 and was one of the last large financial institution to do so. Next year will mark 25 years in the public market. From what we understand about Mark, he's someone who engenders fierce loyalty among people, among some, but also some trepidation among others. He's known for his quick decision-making, and you've already seen that when he's been given charge of this division, where he's jettisoned a couple of units that he thought just didn't work. So that obviously creates a certain level of tension, and there's some level of leadership churn that we've seen in the unit. He obviously explains that as inevitable when you make a lot of the strategy changes that you're making. There is no doubt that he certainly wields a lot of power at the firm right now. And clearly, by virtue of the fact that in the last 5 years, he's run banking, trading, and now asset management, he seems to have the trust and backing of his CEO and the president of the firm.
I have to say there's some great little tidbits in the story, but I love that in order to kind of maybe figure out what he needed to do, he actually binged on The Gilded Age, the HBO drama, which is about, I've watched it, right? It takes you back.
I don't know if he did it for that, but he certainly did binge on The Gilded Age. And as we point out, it is a period drama about, rising to the top in the wealthiest of wealthiest realms of New York City, which I argue is not that different from his current mandate.
It's The Big Take, the Bloomberg Big Take, which is a story that is deemed by our editors as a must-read for the world to kind of understand what's going on. Why do you think it's important that we understand what he is up to right now? And maybe the power or the responsibility that David Solomon has put in his hands?
Because ultimately the through line here is if he succeeds, it could go as far as helping reshape Solomon's legacy. The Goldman Sachs story for the last 1 year, for better or worse, has been the David Solomon story. And David Solomon will not be happy with the legacy that is written, with his legacy that will be written by everyone else, how he will be judged. It will be very different if Nachman succeeds. Goldman stock sees that ability to fire itself up and catch up with rivals. And if 2, 3, 4 years down the line when David Solomon leaves, he has that to show, then it doesn't matter if the leader was warm and cuddly and nice and greeting everyone in the hallways. What matters is the ultimate result. You saw Goldman fire on all cylinders through the pandemic when there was this boom for banking, when there was this boom for trading. But that's all Goldman Sachs. No one is going to jump out and give David Solomon credit for that. He did not invent investment banking at Goldman Sachs. They were really, really good at it. But this is the big change, and this is the big pivot that he's focused on. And if he succeeds and if that has an impact on the stock, then all credit goes to David Solomon.
Shri, we got 30 seconds left. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask you to give us an idea of what we should be watching for early tomorrow morning when we hear from Goldman.
Especially when it comes to this shift.
No, look, the big picture things that you'll obviously be watching for right now is the big important leg of the Goldman Sachs stool still remains the investment bank. And everyone has been hoping, at least the bankers have been hoping, that maybe Q2 was the trough in banking activity. We were talking about this green shoots in capital markets and IPOs coming back in September.
There have been a few.
Yes, but it also feels like that has been stunted a little bit with increasing uncertainty in Washington, rates, the talk of rates perhaps going higher, and also all the conflicts raging in the world. That doesn't necessarily make for a great cocktail for capital markets. But still, investors, analysts will be very interested in hearing what does the backlog look like? What does the receptivity look like? And can 2024 be the year when we truly put this banking doldrums behind us?
Got to run, but it's the Bloomberg Big Take, and it's written by Sri Natarajan. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We check the markets every hour. I'm Steve Rappaport for Bloomberg. Checking the big three on Wall Street, we have the S&P 500 finishing up more than 1%, the Dow gaining less than 1%, the NASDAQ finishing 1.2% higher. Stocks were rising, bonds were falling amid diplomatic efforts to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from expanding into a regional conflict. Oil dropped following last week's rally. Bloomberg Economics estimates that oil could hit $150 a barrel if the conflict spreads further into the region. COMEX gold trading at $1,932.50 an ounce. NYMEX crude $87.08 per barrel. Japanese yen 149.52, the euro 105.5, British pound 1.221. Bitcoin finishing up now, or it's up more than 5%. It hit a bigger number earlier, but then was brought back after a rumor quickly became a reality. Let's get more on that from Bloomberg's Erica Herskowitz.
Steve, Bitcoin reversed an earlier gain of as much as 10% after BlackRock said that its application for an exchange-traded fund that invests directly into the cryptocurrency is still under review. Speculation swirled on social media that BlackRock, which in June submitted an application for a spot Bitcoin ETF, received a green light from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to launch the first such product in the U.S. That spurred the surge in the largest coin, though Bitcoin quickly reversed the majority of those gains after the rumor was debunked. Steve?
Thanks, Erica. Currently, Bitcoin is up more than 5.1%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much. You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovic here in our Interactive Broker Studio on YouTube and, of course, on Bloomberg. Originals. Our thanks to Steve Rappaport in for Charlie Pellet. Hey, we have talked earlier about the latest on the Israeli-Hamas conflict and really the way forward, trying to figure it out and kind of what happens next and how much wider maybe it expands. We have another voice on this, Tim, who comes at it from a few different angles.
Yeah, very pleased to have with us this afternoon Lior Susan, a former Special Forces agent for the Israeli military, also the founder and managing partner of Eclipse Ventures. It's a VC firm that invests in, as they note on their website, quote, entrepreneurs rebuilding the world's physical industries. Lior joins us this afternoon on Zoom from Palo Alto, California. Lior, good to have you with us this afternoon. Just give us your view over the last week as somebody who served as a Special Forces agent in the Israeli military and how you're watching what's going on in Israel and Gaza.
Thank you, folks. Thanks for having me. And first of all, sending my prayers to all of the families that lost their loved ones on both sides. I will start by saying people are talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They must zoom out. This is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are talking about the Western world fighting against terror. It's not a coincidence that the Hamas opened that terrible terror attacks on Israel exactly 10 days ago, when the Saudis was ready to sign historical peace process with Israel that will change the Middle East. Look what's happening in the Middle East with the Gulf countries, with UAE, with Egypt, with Jordan. There is a prosperity, there is a new way of living next to each other, focusing on building companies, focusing on innovation, focusing on technology. The reason that this war started is someone is feel uncomfortable having peace in the Middle East, and it's connect to China, and it's connect to Russia, and of course, it's connect to Iran.
So it's complicated, as we talked earlier, with someone who fought for the U.S. Marine Corps, has done several duties at a very, very high level. It's complicated because there are so many moving parts, if you will, ultimately. Do you see a way forward that, though, ultimately, where, I don't want to say capitalism, but a better economic way for more actually wins out?
There is no any other way around. Israel is not going anywhere, and the Palestinian is not going anywhere. We must find a way to live in peace next to each other. And there is zero chance that that's will happening while a radical terror organization like Hamas controlling Gaza, because they say, actually on their foundation, that their mission in the world is to wipe Jews and Israelis from the map. That's the only thing they believe in, death. You cannot do business with people that wants you to die. But from a fundamental point of view, I love the Palestinians and have a lot of Palestinians friends. And we want to live next to each other in peace, focusing on building the next technology that will cure cancer. As someone that served and saw the pain of war, there is nobody more incentive than I to go and fight against those terror organizations to make sure that we can go and focusing on prosperity rather than fighting.
You served in the special forces for the Israeli military. We see many, many people going back to Israel to serve once again, as hundreds of thousands have been called up. Have you been called up? Are you going back?
Unfortunately, I don't have the clearance that it's required anymore to serve for my country because I live in the United States for more than a decade. All of my friends wants me to be here right now, to focusing and explaining the world that this is not a war between the Israeli and the Palestinian. This is a war between democracy and a radical world, a radical that don't believe in freedom of speech, that don't believe in freedom of religion, and don't believe in prosperity and building businesses. So unfortunately, I need to serve my country from Palo Alto right now.
So talk to us, though. I thought, Lior, what was interesting, because I do think that many think it is a war between Israel and Hamas. But I think there's a feeling, too, of conflict between Israel and Palestine or Palestinians. You say you work with them. Talk to us about, in your role as a founder of Eclipse Ventures, I'm assuming you're investing in all kinds of businesses. Talk to us a little bit about that relationship that you are having with Palestinians.
Yeah, let me give you a sad story. I have a close friend. His name is Eyal Waldman, and he was the founder of a company called Mellanox that sold in a couple of billions of dollars to NVIDIA. Eyal was the first one to establish an R&D centers in the West Bank as well in Gaza, software engineers to support Mellanox. And trust me, he didn't receive a lot of love from the right wings in Israel by doing that. And he employed thousands of people in the West Bank and Gaza that will do software development for him. Because like me, he believed that the only way to fight terror is through business and through friendship. Eyal's daughter was one of those kids that being slaughtered in that music festival 10 days ago. So how ironic is that his daughter that was 23 years old, dancing in a music festival, got slaughtered by Hamas terror, while Eyal is the one that employed thousands of people on the Palestinian side.
There's no words. There's absolutely no words. And I guess what I wonder, too, is, we think about this a lot, Lior, that we think finding an economic way out of things or capitalism ultimately will prevail and lead it to a better way for everyone. I guess what we're just trying to figure out, that there's been conflict in this region, in this area in particular, for such a long time. So I hear what you say. So how do we get the way forward, especially when you still do have terrorists who are out there like Hamas?
I think it's a great example of me traveling to the UAE 10 times this year and doing amazing business and watching His Highness leadership. It's a great example of how you win terror. But which prosperity there is in Lebanon? Is Hezbollah is there to free the Lebanese? Is Hamas is there to free the Palestinians? Is ISIS is there to free the Syrian people? Is Al-Qaeda was there to free Afghanistan? We all in the Western world needs to fight terror so our kids can have a future. And I want my kids to have a future next to my Palestinians neighbors. There is no any other way around, and I will never stop fighting for it.
Are you worried about a potential ground invasion of Gaza? After all, it's been days since Israel warned people in northern Gaza to move to southern Gaza.
And do you think it's wrong, considering what you just said about Palestinians?
I'm sorry and sad about the situation that is happening there. But you need to understand that Israel is not going to sit aside and let the whole rest of the country having 1,300 kids and women that have been slaughtered in one day and more than 150 people kidnapped, most of them civilians, some of them babies on the age of 3 months. Israel cannot continue to have the Hamas sitting in the south part of Israel shooting rockets when they feel comfortable with. Which prosperity happened in Gaza? Israel is out of Gaza from 2005. Which prosperity? Which startup is being built there? Which infrastructure? Which great innovation is happening there? Nothing can be born when there is a radical terror organization controlling your country. And unfortunately, more people are going to lose their life, both sides, because of that organization.
Lior, we have to leave it there, but I hope we can come back to you, and I hope we can come back to you at a time that's more peaceful, certainly in the Middle East at this point, in Israel and Gaza specifically. Lior Susan, former Special Forces agent for the Israeli military, founder and managing partner of Eclipse Ventures. They're an investor, and they are investing in entrepreneurs who are rebuilding specifically the world's physical industries. So you can find more information at their website, but just great to get his perspective, a very unique one, and I think a really important one, joining us from Palo Alto, California. This is Bloomberg.
Let's now get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Dan Schwartzman in the Bloomberg 1130 newsroom here in New York. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Carol and Tim. Israel says its troops have killed the head of Hamas's general intelligence in the Gaza Strip. Israel has amassed a force of around 300,000 soldiers along with tanks and armored vehicles as it prepares for an expected invasion into Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel says Hamas is holding 199 hostages, including foreigners. The group Israeli Hostages and Missing Families Forum says the hostages are, quote, enduring extreme conditions. The group says some of the captives include children with autism, an elderly woman with Parkinson's disease, as well as a man with multiple sclerosis. Ahead of Tuesday's planned vote on the House floor to potentially elect Jim Jordan as House Speaker, the Ohio Republican was scrambling to shore up support with possibly upwards of 40 GOP members currently expected to vote no. Jordan on what's next.
We will go to the floor tomorrow. It's not about pressuring anybody. It's just about we got to have a speaker. You can't open the House and do the work of the American people and help our dearest and closest friend Israel if you don't have a speaker. So we get the speaker, we get the House open, and we get to work on the resolution.
That's Congressman Jim Jordan, the staunch Donald Trump supporter, picked up a key endorsement earlier today. House Armed Services Chairman Mike Rogers offered his support on X, formerly known as Twitter. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be visiting North Korea this week on the heels of a U.S. report stating that the North had delivered military equipment as well as munitions to Russia to support its war in Ukraine. The White House announcing on Friday that over 1,000 containers have so far been sent to Russia from Pyongyang. Lavrov will be in the country on Wednesday and Thursday, and that's just 1 month after leader Kim Jong-un visited Russia to meet with Vladimir Putin. He also, of course, was able to tour military bases. Some believe he was there to check out technology he will ask in return for his help in Ukraine. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. I'm Steve Rappaport. We check the markets all day long at Bloomberg. Stocks rose and bonds fell amid diplomatic efforts to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from expanding into a regional conflict. The S&P 500 adding 46 points. The Dow closed up 314 higher. The Nasdaq picking up 161. Treasury 10-year yields climbed 9 basis points to 4.71%. The dollar retreated. Bitcoin paired gains after surging as much as 10% as BlackRock said its application for an exchange-traded fund that invests directly in the cryptocurrency is still under review. Oil prices retreated following last week's rally. Bloomberg Economics estimates prices could top $150 a barrel if the Israel-Hamas war spreads further.
Inventories across the board are super low. Diesel, gasoline, and products in particular, because refining has really struggled. The positive for crude is that at least there is spare capacity. Saudi Arabia, Russia, they've voluntarily cut production that could be brought back in the event of a genuine supply loss. But ultimately, the market's extremely tight. So yes, I would expect a very quick, rapid rise in prices if there were to be an escalation.
That was Energy Aspects co-founder and director Amrita Sen. Currently, we have NYMEX crude 87.3. That is down less than 1%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much. Steve Rappaport in for Charlie Pellet on this Monday.
All right, Carol, check this out. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of people here in the U.S. who spoke a language at home other than English almost tripled between the years 1980 and 2019. So in terms of numbers, it's nearly 70 million people here in the U.S.
Sounds like a lot, but...
Sounds like a lot.
But...
I'm not one of them.
But what if you're like...
You know, I want to learn a new language. Maybe brush up on that Spanish.
You're not bilingual at all?
Not bilingual.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe brush up on that Spanish from the semester abroad. Did you study abroad?
I did not.
Do you speak another language?
No, but I took, I don't know, 8 years, 10 years of Spanish. So if you throw me into a Spanish-speaking country, I can get along.
Oh, cool. Well, maybe you can also brush up on some of the online services that are available. There are many out there. Among them are the language learning platform Babbel. We've got with us Julie Hansen. She's U.S. CEO of Babbel. It's a privately held company, and it's a role that she's had since 2017. Julie also, we should note, is the former COO and president at Business Insider. She was there when Axel Springer bought BI in a deal that valued the company for $450 million back in 2015. Julie joins us on Zoom from New York. Julie, good to have you with us this afternoon. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you with us. Talk to us a little bit about the growth that you've seen on the platform, because I got to tell you, there is no shortage of places where you can go online to learn languages.
True, but we've seen, Babbel was the originator of the category of online language learning some 17 years ago when it was founded in Germany. And we've seen double-digit growth. Growth really boomed during the pandemic, but then it stayed at very elevated double-digit rates ever since, and we've been able to sustain that growth. And part of what drives it is what you said at the top of the program, that multi-language families are growing in this country, but it's also just become something that's somehow more appealing to do in our culture, and we're benefiting from that.
So, Julie, wait, help me out here. You said obviously makes sense, right? A boom during the pandemic, right? People are at home. They wanted to learn to knit, learn to make sourdough bread, and learn to speak another language. Like, that's what it was about. And stay healthy, no doubt about that, during the pandemic. But you've held on to those levels of growth as well as subscribers. Are you saying that you've maintained those levels and the gains?
Yeah, not quite at the pandemic levels, but we've grown double digit ever since the pandemic. So very strong growth. Babbel is the most sold language learning platform ever. We've sold more than 16 million subscriptions over time. So yeah, I can't tell you all the reasons why, but it just seems like something about the language learning boom during the pandemic validated that as an activity, and people have stayed with it.
I'm curious, like, how does it work? If you become, you sign on and you become a customer of your services, do you become a repeat customer? Is that what often, or is it all about new customer acquisition?
So interesting, actually. In Europe, especially in Germany, we do see quite a bit of repeat purchases, whether people are coming back to a language after a pause, or often they're like learning the next language, which of course is very impressive.
Yeah.
Who are these people?
Who are very strong.
Who are learning so many languages?
Over here in the US, we tend to see that people take a pause and then come back. But language learning is, a long-term activity. You can make progress in a short time period, but you don't become fluent without, a considerable long-term effort. So people know that. And that's actually one of the reasons why lifetime subscription is a very popular option.
Talk to me about the strategy here with Babbel in terms of learning and how Babbel teaches in a way that's different from other platforms. And compare with Duolingo. I know Duolingo's a company, it's publicly traded, it's got a market cap of about $6.9 billion. It went public just a couple of years ago. And that one certainly gets a lot of mind share with especially millennials and Gen Z.
Yep. Definitely different learning approaches. At Babbel, we use a lot of learning science and frankly, a lot of AI embedded in the product. But we do believe that human-led teaching, we have something like 150 didactics experts on staff who've created our courses, that we need to marry their knowledge with technology is basically the essence of what we do. We also believe that you're not going to become perfectly fluent from any app. So that's why we've created other products to support and round out the language learning experience. So it might be a bunch of podcasts. I think we're up to 23 different podcasts. But we also have live teacher-led, virtual classes. And those are an important part of, really, we care about learner success. So we believe that to get learners to succeed, you have to combine learning methods. There's scientific research behind that. It's not just our belief. So it's that combination of human and technology, especially AI, but other technologies too, and the idea of creating a whole surround sound of learning experiences.
It's really interesting. How much of your business is B2B, business to business? I'm always curious about, or is a lot of it just individuals who want to learn a language?
Well, the B2B is the fastest growing segment of our business by far. It's the newest compared to the consumer, though, so it's not nearly as big, but growing fast. And those are very interesting use cases. We started that business in Europe. We found, international companies, multinational companies needed help. And then we came to the US, and it took a while for the use case to become clear here. But we believe the growth opportunity is massive in the US based on just migration patterns, because often Babbel is brought in for language teaching in situations where there's workplace safety at risk. We have a very diverse group of clients here, from a bunch of MLB teams. Maybe safety isn't quite the thing there. It's excellence, but down to meat packers, landscapers. Places where language barriers create safety issues, and there's a big opportunity in that.
Talk to me about mobile versus desktop right now. What's the share on mobile?
When I started here, if you can imagine, people actually. There was a lot of desktop usage. That was just 6 years ago. And I thought it was really peculiar, frankly, coming from the US. But now we're a mobile app. There are still some people who use the product on their desktop or maybe their iPad, but it's a mobile world.
What does it typically cost for somebody who wants to subscribe or learn a language?
You can start in the US if you want to just try a 1-month subscription for about $15. If you want to subscribe for the year, more like $90. You can pick up a lifetime subscription for, call it $300. So in that range.
And your biggest market or fastest growing market, is it the US? Just got about 30 seconds left here.
Yes to both. The US was the last one that we found success in, and it took a very dedicated approach, but it's now the biggest market, the fastest growing. It's all about learning Mexican Spanish in the US market. But we teach all of our 14 languages, but that's the popular language here.
Really interesting. Thanks for all the insight. Really fascinating. Julie Hansen, US CEO of Babbel, and joining us, of course, on Zoom in New York City.
Now, your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Steve Rappaport. Shares of Shell hitting a record high today, and that is after the CEO turned attention to greater emphasis on fuel in its portfolio, and that appeased investors. Turning over to the pharmaceuticals now, we have Pfizer going up. That was despite announcements from the company that they were going to be cutting their sales outlook by $9 billion, and that was because of demand for COVID-19 vaccines waning. Shares of Moderna, though, went the other way. They ended up closing down, or rather, they were lower as much as 8% today, and that, too, was related to the demand of vaccines as we move further and further from the pandemic. The head of the UAW is calling on, or rather, Ford is calling on the United Auto Workers Union to come back to the bargaining table and end what the company executive calls an acrimonious round of contract talks. Ford was one of the big three automakers to be hit by simultaneous strikes by the UAW. That was hitting GM, Ford, and Stellantis. Last week, Sean Fain surprised Ford by putting a strike on Ford's biggest factory in Kentucky. That's the one that makes the high-end trucks and the SUVs. Shares of Ford closing 1% higher. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
It's Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenivek and Carol Masser. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio here in New York City. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Dan Schwartzman here in the Bloomberg 1130 newsroom in New York. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Carol and Tim. 2 Swedish nationals have been killed in Brussels, Belgium, as prosecutors are investigating whether the attack was terrorist-related. Belgrade News has cited a video circulating on social media where a man declares in Arabic that he shot the 2 victims out of revenge. Sweden and Belgium were playing a Euro 2024 qualifying soccer match, with the game then suspended at halftime after news of the shooting broke. The death toll from last weekend's assault by Hamas into Israel, as well as Israel's retaliation, continues to mount. Israel has announced that more than 1,400 people were killed, with 3,400 wounded. The Palestinian Ministry of Health says that the death toll in Gaza has risen to at least 2,750, with close to 10,000 more injured. As we know, Israel's military indicating it plans to go into Gaza by air, land, and sea. The buildup continues. Over 300,000 troops massed on the borders. Nick Mulroy, a former CIA officer and co-founder of the Lobo Institute, says the attack is coming soon.
They're going big, and it's going to be violent. They'll probably have some come in from the sea to create a dilemma from Hamas, maybe some coming from the air to try to drop behind them in central Gaza, to try to create a dilemma and envelop them. But once they get into the actual fighting, it's going to be block by block. I'm hearing the Israeli planners that talk about upper and lower Gaza. Upper being buildings and everything that you see normally in a city. Lower is all these tunnels. There's around 300 miles of tunnels down there. And that's going to be a bear militarily to try to conquer.
That's Mick Mulroy of the Lobo Institute. He was a guest on Bloomberg Markets. You can hear more of his thoughts on today's edition of the Tape Podcast. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg. Back to Carol and Tim.
All right, Dan Schwartzman, thank you so much. In for Nancy Lyons on this Monday. So you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser, Tim Stenivek here, as you know.
Should we talk politics?
You want to talk a little politics?
Yeah, let's talk some politics here.
Nothing going on, right?
No, nothing going on,
Where do you
especially
wanna go?
for Speaker of the House.
Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about what's going on with Speaker of the House. GOP's Jim Jordan picks up critical support for House speakership. He's the headline conservative, and he gained momentum today in his campaign to be U.S. House Speaker, picking up the endorsement of 3 GOP defense hawks, swayed by his promise to fund the military and his vow to, quote, destroy Hamas and support Israel.
Which is interesting because some of the hawkish Republicans out there have generally been hesitant to get behind Jordan. He is a Donald Trump loyalist. He has supported an isolationist America First agenda. Now, Jordan, who previously opposed Ukraine aid, has sent conflicting messages in public and also in private on how he would handle the issue, and his hardline stance is risk an automatic 1% cut to U.S. defense spending next year, which is hard to kind of get your head around considering the conflict conflict and how important the U.S. is, their support, whether it's Israel, whether it's Ukraine, is to all of that.
Yeah, this is an isolationist. That's what's interesting. If he's known as an isolationist, and certainly he opposed Ukraine aid, but you know, the hardliners or the hawks on the GOP were assured that he would support Israel.
He's won over Armed Services Chairman Mike Rogers, Ken Calvert, who is the top Republican on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and Ann Wagner, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So those are big wins, considering he is an isolationist.
All right, it's not in the bag yet, though, because he can only afford to lose 4 Republicans, Carol. So unless Democrats help him or some lawmakers don't vote. So that means he must woo GOP moderates, including many of the 18 who come from areas President Joe Biden won in 2020.
Do you think he's really wooing them? Is it like taking them out for a date and offering them what does that mean? I always love that word.
I don't know. I don't know what it means.
I digress.
Back deal.